Hello, everybody. I'm thrilled to be talking with Seth David Radwell, who I got to know about a year ago. Seth wears many hats, and I could spend the whole interview reading his varied biography. He's an entrepreneur. He attended the Harvard University School of Government and has a lot of knowledge about that. And I came to know Seth through a book. He's an internationally known author and speaker, and his book's called American Schism: How the Two Enlightenments Hold the Secret to the Healing of Our Nation. And I think we'll start our conversation with that. But hello, Seth, and thank you so much for participating in this interview. I really appreciate it.
Well, David, I'm thrilled to be here. I admire so much the work that you do, and I've gotten to know you over the past year, and I'm really happy to be able to be here today with you.
Well, thank you. And getting to know each other, the term American Schism and what that means is very much connected to the work of the Bridge Alliance and the work of the Fulcrum, trying to heal the divide that separates us. So that's maybe a perfect way to start, is if you give us a little of the thesis of American Schism, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, the basic thesis that led me to do this work was to find out, to do an investigative tracing in our history of why we're so divided today. And the thesis is that basically we have been a divided country going back to since our founding. And when what I call the original American Schism was a major dispute between what became the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Party. Now, what I do in the book is trace that division over time. And I'm convinced that, number one, those same roots are what's working today. And number two, in order to get to heal today, we need to understand our history and where we've been. That history can act as a salve for our wounds, but we have to apply it. And so that's why, you know, the tracing of our divisions back to the founding is important. And that's what I talk about very frequently today.
Well, in one sense, that perspective could be seen as an optimistic perspective, but it also could seem pessimistic in this context. Pessimistic, maybe, that we've always been divided. You know, this is nothing new. But I guess from an optimistic standpoint, it could be that we've gone through these challenges before, and you can see that if we learn from history, we can learn to solve some of these problems. Is that the basic concept?
Yeah, but let me be clear. I am very seriously concerned that we are at a tipping point, that it's not clear right now whether we will be able to bestow a democratic republic to our kids. So yes, that we've been divided before, but the whole lesson of the book American Schism is to distill what I call a secret sauce. Like, when we've been divided before, how has there been a commonality in how we've approached it? And there is, in fact, a magic formula when we've used has worked pretty well. When we haven't, we've had things like the Civil War, and we've almost come apart many times. So it's not guaranteed by any means. Now, here's the problem, David, is that the secret sauce has a couple of elements, but all of those elements are suppressed today. They're not being used. Like, for example, one of the key elements of the secret sauce is being willing to approach problem solving in an empirical fashion, where we use data to drive solutions. And what I show in the book and in my writings is that in the public sector today, the incentives are all against that. And that's, you know, why everyone has their own truth. And that's an example of a secret sauce element that we're not using. So my mission in life, in most of my career, as you know, I was a business person.
Yes.
But what got me involved in this work is that my mission is that we need to engage private sector leaders, because in their businesses, they use the elements of the secret sauce very well. And we need to inject that problem solving back into the public sector.
Well, let's delve into the secret sauce. Is it one sauce, or is it 4 or 5 ingredients that are the key?
There are about
that. Yes.
There are four ingredients. I would love your listeners to read the book, but I'll give you a shortcut. There are. So the first one, as I mentioned, is having a problem-solving orientation that's grounded in empiricism, where data matters. That's the one of the base ones. The second one is a belief and understanding that in that problem solving, incorporating diverse points of view helps get to a better solution. That diversity of opinion is to be embraced. That's part of the secret sauce. And a third part is that once you do that, you're willing to compromise. In other words, get to a solution even when you don't get all you want. So, for example, we've had an immigration comprehensive reform bill on the floor ready to pass 4 or 5 times in 15 years, and we never get there. So that's an example where you can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And those are 3 main elements of the secret sauce. And I would argue, and I'd love to get your listeners' view on this. CEOs particularly use all 3 of those in their daily life. That's how they operate. So that's a little more color on these different elements: empiricism, fact, problem solving, listening to other points of view, but also incorporating them in the solution space, and knowing from the start that the system is one in which you won't get everything you want, that you're going to have to compromise, and not letting today, of course, in the political arena, compromise seems like a dirty word, but it's fundamental to how we make progress.
Well, let me ask you this. In terms of the problem, I believe it, obviously because I'm involved in making our democracy healthier and reforming our democracy, but to have this problem-solving approach and to have compromise and believing that we need a diversity of opinions, are there particular aspects of our democracy itself, going back to the Constitution, that make that difficult, if not impossible, to achieve because of some fundamental dysfunctions within the system itself?
Yes. And that's also where history is helpful. Let me give an example. In the 19th century, the journalism in America had become sensationalist, and it was called yellow journalism. It was like today, where it's hard to get information. We went through decades where information at the end of the 19th century was extremely hard because of how poor journalism. It wasn't really a journalistic profession as we know it today. In fact, originally Joseph Pulitzer, but the birth of journalism as a profession was evolved very much to deal with the problem of no good information, and accuracy of reporting and truth finding became the center of the value hierarchy in journalism in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, when you and I were kids and we listened to Walter Cronkite. So that's an example where we've solved this problem before, and yet it seems that our young people today, and this is largely a problem. It's a problem of incentives. So in other words, in journalism today, which is now called media, it's all about getting eyeballs, which usually works better if you're sensationalist. So that's a problem. But the consumers, young people today, don't understand well enough that to operate in a democratic republic, they need to demand and search for truth. You can't believe the first tweet you see. So I think in terms of the information arena, you have terrible incentives today, which is very much feeding the problem. And yet our history has examples where we've overcome this.
Although, I mean, history is certainly valuable to learn from history. And when you talk about yellow journalism, do you think there's something fundamentally different because of social media and technology that makes the solving of this problem quite a bit more complicated?
Yes, there is. Let me try to be specific with you on this. So I mentioned the founding of the journalistic industry in the 1920s, which is when the first journalism schools, Missouri, I think, and Columbia. But then as the profession grew, it had a whole association. So 20 years ago, there were about 150,000 local papers in the country. And those local papers were where young journalists just out of school got to practice their craft, got to learn how to fact find and get to the bottom of a story. Guess what portion of those independent local newspapers exists today? It's I think less than 10%. Yes. So we had a minor league system for how to grow journalists, where in fact fact-finding and verification and sources, verifying sources was so important. They learned that. And the good ones, of course, got to report for the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, but we had hundreds of thousands of people in the field. So that's an example where, the internet's a wonderful thing, but one of the downsides is that we use it to get our information where we don't have the training ground, the minor league of learning how to do reporting. And of course, the media model is completely driven by advertising. So that's also a problem.
Fascinating. I mean, there's so many aspects of this I could talk about, but maybe I'll start with a big question, then we'll get back into some specifics.
Sure.
I think you have, well, I know because the Fulcrum has been blessed to have, I think, 14, maybe more of your writings at this juncture. I've lost track of how many. And I believe one of your writings was entitled The American Experiment, a Democratic Republic.
Right.
Is it worth defending? So
right.
rather than talk about the problems and how to solve the problems, maybe that's a place to start. Why is it worth defending? Why is democracy important in the first place? Why do you care?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's so important. We seem to be stuck, besides in our own information bubbles, in a time bubble. Look, for all of our problems in our history, and we have many of those, the American experiment in self-government is still the best example in the history of the world. For thousands of years, and this is where history in a broader sense is important, people's lives were determined by how they were born, and if the only path, if you were born into being a common person, not noble, the only path maybe to have a better life was to join the clergy. But the whole notion of what's happened since the Enlightenment, which, by the way, is why the Enlightenment is so grounding for me, is we've created a tremendous, we've created more human progress, prosperity in the last 200 years than in the prior 2000. And that's largely due to the scientific revolution and something called the Enlightenment, where we now, in a political way, in a political economy, we can all participate in the solution. And it's a wonderful thing. There's a book by Jonathan Roach called The Constitution of Knowledge, which shows just how powerful the democratic republic that we've built is. So it is worth defending. 200 years ago, when the country was founded, 250 years ago, life expectancy on the planet was 32 years. Now it's over 70 years all over the planet. I can give you many stats like that. 250 years ago, 1 in 5 children died before the age of 4. Obviously, that is much more positive. So we have problems, but it's not despite our democratic republic. It's the democratic republican system and the economic system, by the way, which needs changing, is that the solution to solving our problems. And that's what it's so important to educate not only young people, but I would say 60–70% of Americans that are part of what I call the frustrated majority. In other words, they don't understand the political extremes and why they dominate, but they stay out of the conversation.
Well, I'll jump to another subject because you just threw in the economic system needs changing. What is the relationship in your mind between democracy, the experiment, the American experiment, and how that's changing, and also how economics has changed in the United States historically from the past to the present, and where it should be going? What are your thoughts related to that?
Well, that's a wonderful question, because, in fact, tied to that prosperity, I would argue, is an economic model of innovation, which is driven by capitalism. But unfortunately, when I use that term, the capitalism that we have today has become warped and is way out of bounds. So let's go back for a second to Adam Smith. The whole brilliance of an innovative capitalist system, the notion was that if you and I are competing and making a product, if we're to get wealthier, both of us have to work hard to make the product better. We have to come up with better solutions. So it's the notion that whilst trying to make money, you're improving society by creating better products and services. That is the core of why capitalism is so important. If we look at traditional communist or socialist societies, they don't have incentives to innovate that way. Now, that being said, there are fundamental rules in capitalism if you really understand how it's supposed to work economically. For example, what we have today is cheater capitalism. So as opposed to competing, we have a couple of big firms in each industry who get enough power to corrupt people to help them write the laws and the rules. Imagine, we just came through the Olympics, which I was fortunate to be at. Imagine if you could compete in the Olympics, but there were no rules. That's what our capitalist system has become. The people, the biggest players are writing the rules through their political power. And this has happened before. It was when what led to Roosevelt's reforms, even Teddy Roosevelt in the progressive era, was an era when he broke up and dealt with some of the ways the capitalist model was not working. So I think there's a lot written about this, but another great example that I could use for your listeners is, one of the rules in economics is that people grow profits. Business people grow profits by increasing revenues and lowering costs. That's what equals profit. So right now we have a capitalist system where most of the firms who are competing are not taking into account one key part of their costs. And that is the carbon they're putting into the atmosphere, because there's a cost there. So if that was internalized, if that externality in the terms of economics was internalized, and you and I were competing to make a product, we'd be able to unlaunch that innovation engine of capitalism to make the better product with less carbon emission. And so that's an example where by letting the externality go unfixed, broken, we hurt ourselves. And any good economist understands that things like externalities, or another example is public goods. So I think that's a category of good and service where there's not enough incentive for individuals to do it. So there has to be government incentives, like the military, defense, or parks, or those are all examples of public goods which need incentives. So I'm just giving examples when we talk about capitalism, and one of the reasons it gets such a bad rap today is because we're not playing by the rules. The rules are set by billionaires, and we seem to allow that to continue without any fixing.
Well, it's interesting. Your perspective, and if you get into politics as it is today, if a politician, usually from the left, talks about the billionaires and the rules and a lot of the things you talked about, they'll immediately be called a socialist.
Yes.
Yet you started your discussion by saying you're a capitalist. You not only admitted it, you are a proud capitalist.
It's a wonderful system.
So the two, in your mind, you can have some serious regulation. Actually, you're supporting greater capitalism in a sense, but is there a contradiction that in supporting greater capitalism, you want the government to control it more? Is that
no? The government needs to create incentives to fix the problem. So let's stick with the environment for a second. One of the major issues in making progress on what I think is now proved climate change that's hurting the planet and endangering us is that the oil industry and the power of the fossil fuel industry politically is huge. Now, the way to deal with that, in my view, using capitalism, is to make help make incentives like the ones I mentioned with externalizing carbon release, for example, but also getting the fossil fuel industry to be part of the solution. In other words, giving them incentives not to take control of those industries, but to push them to make more green energy and make money from doing it if they do it better than their competitors. So I guess what I would say is, in the spirit of Adam Smith and all the great writers of economics since him, the capitalism is a framework, a model, and it works. Most of the way it works well is when there are certain regulations or rules so that it's a system. It's not just let to go wild. Like, for example, one of the great rules of economics is that markets are efficient, which means you get more prosperity, basically, if we all have equal we all have equal access to information, all consumers. And of course we don't, which is why we have things like the FDA to tell consumers that this drug is really not good. Or we have the FTC to make sure consumers are not getting ripped off in a marketing sense. I mean, all these government regulation agencies since Reagan have been given a bad rap. But in fact, if you don't have them, you don't have an operating capitalism.
Well, this is all fascinating to me, and I hope to our city business audience as well. And we've talked a lot about uh, government reform and how it works and economics. But your book speaks a lot about more than those type of things, speaks a lot about vision and division and the cultural divide. And many of us, people I talk to my age, it's worse than ever. It's
It
horrible.
is.
But so what perspective, but at the same time, we've always been culturally divided. So how do you see the current situation in our country? Is it a phase? Is it something fundamentally different as you historically look back at America? And are you optimistic or pessimistic? Those are three questions in one, but you could
Well,
slide any way you'd like on that one.
let me start with the premise that, I've been talking a lot about the problems. The third part of American Schism lays out a plan to fix this. And it involves, I would say, two fundamental pieces. On one hand, we have to change our mindset. We have to really understand what it means to be a citizen in a social contract, because we've gotten so far away from that, that hating each other seems to be the raison d'etre of today. So this mindset piece is one half. The other half are actual structural reforms to get the bad incentives out. So one great example is, 85% of the districts are safe because they're gerrymandered in Congress, I'm talking. So because of that, 8% of the electorate elects 85% of our Congress people, because it's the primary that counts, and many primaries are closed. So that's an example where opening up primaries could make a big difference of not getting extremists in Congress. I'm just trying to give concrete examples for your listeners.
Of course, yes.
So there are structural reforms and there are mindset reforms. Now, you asked the $24,000 question, which is this a phase? Has it happened before? There's a great book out by Robert Putnam, which talks about how much this is wavering, that we have seemed to go through periods in our history when we're like, the me generation, I, and other times when we've bound together and built communities in a better way. I have the book here somewhere, but I think it's Robert Putnam, The Upturn or something like that. Anyway, so yes, this is cyclical. And an example of that would be, let me give you an example. In the 1890s, we were in a period called the Gilded Age. I made a quick reference to this before, and it was an age where ostentatious wealth was ruling the country, and there were industries like oil and like railroads, which created also, like today, a huge distribution of wealth that was extreme. And the Gilded Age had many characteristics, but it was definitely one where we didn't see ourselves as part of a whole community. But somehow a populist movement started in the farming community, actually called the Farmers Alliance, in the late part of the century. That the purpose of the Farmers Alliance originally was these farmers were getting killed. They couldn't make money because the railroads were controlling prices of transporting goods, the steel mills. So they started to bound together in groups to have purchasing power, et cetera. It led to the Progressive Era, where both presidents of both parties, Woodrow Wilson in some degree and Teddy Roosevelt, both embraced reforms to move prosperity to a more broader piece of American society. Communities flourished. Churches, were very important in that. So yes, it is cyclical. And I think one of the things that we have to look at ourselves is, and ask ourselves is, digital information and Facebook's wonderful, but if that completely replaces the community interaction that we have with our fellow citizens, that's a recipe for disaster. I think we need to relate to each other in a community, whether it's your local community, your local church, or whether it's the PTA at your school. We need to be in a room, in a safe space where people can interact. The problem with doing all that on Twitter or Facebook is that it's anonymous and you can say horrible things. Things you would never say face-to-face to somebody. I mean, in that face-to-face community part, we've moved towards it and away from it. And I think, remember John Kennedy's, you can do more for your country. That was from World War I on, really through the 60s. we were very much about community. And then something happened in the 70s with the liberation movements that led to unrestrained capitalism. There's a lot in his book that describes it. In my book, I also talk about the patterns. But yes, this is very cyclical, but we have to recognize that we can't keep operating this way, hating each other, but, thinking that we as Americans are the enemy. And I'm talking about both sides here now, that whether it's the extremists on the left or right, they really truly believe that the political other side are evil people. And that's a horrible way to try to listen to each other.
So if our audience, which I'm sure many, many of them will be, are fascinated by this conversation and intrigued and read your book, The American Schism, which they can find on Amazon. What do you think, what's your goal that the takeaway would be? That they become more involved, that they become more optimistic, that they learn through history that there is hope? I mean, is there a specific goal that you would like? Let's say 10,000 people listen to this interview and buy your book. What do you would hope happens from it?
Well, the first thing I would love, I try to kind of preach, so to speak, is what we started with, which is why our democratic republic, with all of our warts in history, why it's worth defending, what it's done so incredibly well. That's the first point I try to make. But I think beyond that, it's that, we don't get to have a democratic republic and this prosperity without some work. And the civic arena is a fundamental part of what makes a society, a culture, a country work. Some of the great enlighteners that I talk about in the book wrote about how we could never have a democracy, or let's say an egalitarian society, unless people understood and were educated in what I call it civics, but it's really society's all about. Now, so one of the things that I try to do is to get people to become engaged. So let's say it's business people, because that's my audience. I'm a former CEO. Business people are like hiding in the wings. Their heads in the sand. They're afraid to engage on the problems we have in the public sphere because they're afraid of bringing on the wrath of some group on they're being like outed. And in fact, what I try to show business people is that you can embrace democratic reform in a nonpartisan way that doesn't involve touching a third rail. It's basic involvement in groups that are trying to do this reform, whether it's open primaries, rank the vote, whether it's redistricting. So I try to engage business people I show them ways that they can get involved without touching the third rail, let's say. And as accordingly, I'm on the board of Business for America. I work with a group called Leadership Now Project. So I'm actively plugged into that world, trying to get business leaders more engaged. Let's go to another audience, students, young people. Young people are the future of the country, and they're so fundamental. And one of the most painful things in my research that I've done, both for the book and since then, is how many young people today, for example, would sit out the election. They don't like Trump or Biden, and we'll talk about Harris in a second. The point is they are completely disillusioned with our system. And as a result, they listen to the voices that believe it's better to take the whole thing down, which I think is really dangerous. Yeah. So in fact, speaking to young people about their role is one of the most important things I can do. And I think your listeners probably have understood by now that I do this work not to make money. I mean, I would have stayed in business and build companies. I really believe that if we're going to save this incredible experiment, we have to work at it. It's not, we're not on a good path now. So I hope that answered some of your questions.
Well, it did. And I'm really running out of time, but I'll ask you one more. But I'm thrilled you gave that answer, because the City Biz audience, we appeal to a variety of people with all spectrum of life. But I do want the business people that listen to this to realize they can make a difference. And I have had several people who've told me they've read your book and they've become involved because of what they read. So that's one important takeaway from this interview. But the last question, because we are running out of time, is let's say many Americans read your book and listen to other reform leaders and practitioners and scholars and academics that have been interviewed through the City Biz interviews, or they read them through the Fulcrum or whatever. What's going to change, and why is it important? In other words, 30 years from now, if
Right.
your vision comes to fruition, why would it make any difference in the average American's life?
Because we as Americans are spending tremendous amount of energy and cycles fighting with each other as opposed to addressing problems. I mean, we have real problems, and and as opposed to addressing them, we kind of prefer to fight about it. Now, I think whether it's immigration, climate change, homelessness, these are problems that need addressing. Now, I think part of the problem is I think the public, the political arena has become entertainment, and we enjoy the fighting. It's become, in some ways, the fact that Trump was from The Apprentice is not surprising. The problem solving is not so entertaining. It requires digging into data. Let's look. We have major issues today. One problem with the immigration system. Now, comprehensive reform requires, in fact, better border security, better system for asylums, more police, a lot of things. We've had a comprehensive immigration reform bill on the floor 4 times in the last 12 years. It never passes because the incentives in Washington are to fight about it. So yes, this is really important, and we're not going to solve the problems unless we do it. What I say to young people, especially, but also business people, is it's time to take the gavel back from the extremes who are running the asylum and put some logical problem solving back into the public sector.
Well, Seth, I hope our audience takes you seriously. I certainly do. And it is indeed time to take the gavel back, and a perfect way to end. I recommend everybody you read your book, everybody read your columns, many of them in the Fulcrum. I wanted to talk about critical thinking, but that'll be next time. So,
okay. Well, I'd be happy to come back.
Yes, we'll do that for sure. Thank you. It's been a true pleasure. Thank you
This
very
has
much.
been great. Thank you, guys. I've enjoyed this.
Okay, thank you.